Hi, welcome to another episode of MYD Global. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. FEMA has a number of resources on its website. One of their more current resources that they've released is the Community Lifeline Toolkit. In this episode, I speak with Tim Riecker, an emergency management expert, about these 7 community lifelines, in particular, how communities are using them, not only in their preparedness and response, but in their recovery plans as well. So stay tuned. Hey, Tim, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Leanne. How about you?
I'm good. So before we get started on our topic today, can you just explain to the viewers a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So I've been in public safety for about 23 years, accounting for all that and kind of with some overlap, so the math doesn't completely line up. About 10 years of that was fire and EMS, including some time as a chief officer. Learned enough to not want to do that again. I had about 10 years working for the state's emergency management office. I left there in the position of chief of training and exercises. And then about 10 years of work as a consultant. 8 of those have been running my own business, which is Emergency Preparedness Solutions. Most of my work focuses on research and assessment, planning, training, exercises. I obviously work with a lot of different standards like the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, the Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program, HSEEP, NFPA 1600, things like that. And I do I keep tabs on a lot of different emerging trends and new applications like FEMA's Community Lifelines.
Yeah, well, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. So FEMA introduced, and I don't remember how long ago, it wasn't that long ago, but I think there's 7 community lifelines. Can you just explain what they are?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Community Lifelines, you're absolutely right. They were a tool developed by FEMA. Let's see, I would say, I know they ended up in the National Response Framework last year. So they were developed a little bit before that. So maybe 2 years old, formally at least. And so what these do is these organize the top 7 categories of fundamental services that you'll find in most communities at least. So primarily these are safety and security. So that includes things like law enforcement, fire service, search and rescue, government services, that kind of stuff. Food, water, and shelter, pretty explanatory. That also includes agriculture in there. Health and medical, which is medical care, public health, EMS is on that side. Any kind of patient movement, supply chains for medical stuff, as well as fatality management. Energy, which is generally our power grid and any kind of fuels we use. Communications, which includes really kind of the full swath of communication. So it's our infrastructure, it's our responder communications, it's any kind of alerts, warnings, messages that we use, 911 dispatch. It also includes finance. Mostly because the actual backbone of our finance system is the ability between banks to communicate, do wire transfers and that kind of stuff. So banks are actually included in communications. You have transportation, which is full multimodal, and then hazardous materials, which is both fixed and in transit. So each of these categories basically consists of kind of this connected network of different assets and services and capabilities. And really by breaking these things down into their most essential infrastructure, if you will, these 7 lifelines and their components, using them, we're better able to identify and track any kinds of disruptions, prioritize stabilization, restoration, obviously down the road. And really what they do for us is kind of similar to NIMS, similar to the concepts of ICS, where we always talk about consistent terminology and definitions. These 7 community lifelines give us consistent definitions within each what one is. And so they kind of give us buckets, if you will, to help us do those assessments and then prepare for things, respond, and even going into recovery and mitigation.
And so just in a practical term, say a disaster happens in a community, your emergency operations center would be tracking these 7 lifelines and saying, okay, say in energy, this is the current situation. Do you code it by green, yellow, red? Is that correct or no?
They can, yeah, yeah. So communities certainly can do that. The start of this actually, so again, came from FEMA, and FEMA had been using this concept for a while to basically do some of their own situation tracking and situation reporting. So they had basically identified these 7 things, and as they were, when they had a federal declaration and FEMA was interfacing with state and local governments, their own tracking and their reporting was being organized by these community lifelines. And so they kind of honed it over time. They identified it as a best practice, and then essentially made that whole concept publicly available to us. So it can certainly be scaled down to local governments, state governments, and others to be able to use. Yes, so you can use it to track things, basically organize how your situational information is. But of course, even backing up from there, everything starts with preparedness. Yeah. So, you can incorporate into your plans. Obviously, if you're going to do something in response, you should have plans and procedures that identify how you're going to do that. You can even do it in hazard mitigation, which is something it was never intended for. But by looking at these 7 categories, we can assess where our vulnerabilities are, and we can actually identify what kind of capabilities that we need to actually reduce impacts. And so we can do that, obviously preparedness, planning, training, exercises to get us ready for doing it. And then again, it goes on into recovery when we're trying to not just stabilize, but actually restore these. And so like I've included community lifelines over the past several months into some plans and projects that I've done for clients, which really helps them focus on prioritization of their essential response operations, as well as the information management that's needed for situation reporting and such.
I think that's great, because that's where I was trying to get clarity. I thought, okay, so are these just meant to be in the response phase, or does this have wider application amongst the preparedness, the response, recovery piece? So I can see how having these various categories at least is a start where you can start thinking, okay, let's group here, look at all the things we have under this lifeline and track how we're doing and improve. So
exactly. And you mentioned the color coding system that they have. Yeah. And with that, so, green, green, yellow, red, kind of just like your atypical status or stoplight type of thing. Green means everything is good. Yellow means you have some problems or some disruption. And then red is obviously a major disruption in it. And so you can then apply that not only to each of those 7 buckets, but then also the categories within those buckets. So you can really, really refine a lot of things and truly get into the weeds, but it's also terrific to have that recognition, and color coding is obviously really apparent. So it helps to convey the problems and the priorities that you have going on in a response pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you, you're consulting with communities all the time. I'm just curious, do you know if there's 1 or 2 that have a best practice where you could say, yeah, there's a resource online that if you look at how this community is doing it, it's a best practice, or it's a good example, or is it still too early to have someone who's really knocking it out of the park with the lifelines?
I think it's pretty early yet. We're probably having, unfortunately, with especially the hurricanes that hit the Gulf Coast within the last week or 2, there's a lot of jurisdictions down there. If they're using community lifelines, they're getting some opportunity to kind of practice those things and flex those muscles and see how they're actually working out for them. But like a lot of things, it's fairly early. Obviously we've all been dealing with the pandemic, but and of course, I think the struggle that we have in a lot of cases with the pandemic in terms of disaster recovery is that disaster recovery traditionally has always included some kind of physical damages or impact. Yeah. And from the pandemic, we're not seeing, we don't have entire neighborhoods that are destroyed. So it's a very, very different thing for us in recovery that we're dealing with. And in terms of the lifelines, really the only disruption or potential for disruption has largely been things like business continuity or operational continuity. and then maybe some of the supply chain types of issues and that kind of stuff that we've seen, particularly in the healthcare area. So the lifelines probably didn't get a whole lot of use then. But yeah, I think from some of these other disasters, there's some opportunity to do that. And we'll see down the road. It obviously takes a few months for those things to get reported and translated out there for people to consume and take a look at and see how they go.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to mention that perhaps I didn't ask about?
So FEMA's website does have a Community Lifelines toolkit, which is available. So that includes a lot of different fact sheets, templates. There's an incident stabilization guide, which basically helps with some of that color coding, and it really gets down into those finite components of each of the community lifelines. The iconography, so all the little symbols, and it gives you the symbols in the different colors. So if you decide you want to incorporate those into your situation reports, all that stuff is there, and they just have one big document that has all those color-coded symbols in it to help you out. So like I said, a lot of what's provided is based on how FEMA has used the community lifelines, but I think with a little bit of thought, you can really modify these for use by local and state jurisdictions.
That's great.
Yeah. So I'd even suggest working with stakeholder groups, like with each lifeline in your community. So if you want to look at energy, or you want to look at safety and security, you can probably form some really terrific stakeholder groups within communities around each of those to figure out what maybe some of those trigger points are, or what evaluation or an assessment is going to look like of those when a disaster does occur, and really kind of start to build some plans and some action, getting some action centered around that. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there.
Yeah, and it's a great way to just start that process, right? Just get everyone together and even just meet people and say, okay, I didn't even know you existed. And, let's talk about how we can work together in the case of a disaster. So, yeah.
Exactly. And since a lot of the community lifelines, they're not just government. There's also a lot of private sector to that. So, and even nonprofits. So I think that this is just, it's another excuse to really, FEMA talks about whole community all the time. And so this is a great opportunity to really engage that whole community in looking at this and seeing how you can prepare. And again, even venturing into things that I don't think it was ever intended for, like mitigation, but it certainly works. And you can, any community could really even reference their existing hazard mitigation plan and associate it with this and kind of create this really maybe much more easily referenced worksheet than what we oftentimes see in hazard mitigation plans to really help support this. So I think everyone should take a look at it, at least spend some time looking through it. I think just like a lot of things that aren't necessarily standards, there's an opportunity here to figure out how you want to use it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be full implementation, whatever makes sense for you, for your community to use, and incorporate it in your plans, train on it, exercise it, and hopefully that'll help it increase some capabilities.
And that's great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time today to just shed a little light on these 7 lifelines and how they can be used. And I will reference the toolkit in the video description below. And wish you all the best as you continue to help communities prepare and respond and recover.
Thanks, Leanne. My pleasure.